Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila. It happened in 1892, and the story's called Bulgar's Friends. Well, Bulgar, he was kind of an interesting fellow all the way around. He had a big, fluffy white beard and white hair, and he lived in a little hut that he'd built down by the stream. That hut, although the wind couldn't get in and the rain couldn't get in or the snow, it was built with little pieces of lumber, a little bit of iron, a little bit of tin, but the local kids, they thought he was just odd. And he didn't like anybody to come visit him. He would get grumpy then. So the kids were afraid of him. They figured out what they thought was what was going on with Bulgar. And they made a story that he had all kinds of riches, gold and silver, buried underneath his hut, and that's why he didn't want anybody to visit him or come close to him. Well, nobody knew if that was true or not, but it did make it so the kids went a long ways around his hut. Well, in those days, as well as still today, there was an agency, not really a church, but kind of like that believed in Jesus, and they were called the Salvation Army. Now, we still have Salvation Army today. And do you know what they did? They got a big building, and in that building, the poor could go, and they could sleep there where it was warm. They could eat food there, and the only requirement was that they had to go to the meeting every night. The meeting told them about Jesus. They also had like a Salvation Army band, and they would march down the street to a street corner, and they would play music. Well, Bulgar had watched this all going on, and he was old. One day, he went in to the Salvation Army building, and one of the men, who was one of they called them captains, he went over to Bulgar, and he asked him how he was and all the nice things. And Bulgar said, "I'm just wondering, that commander," he said, the captain, he said, "Bulgar, have you ever given your life to Jesus?" And Bulgar said, "I can't think that it would be fair to him, since I'm old and I could die any day, and look at what I look like. Would he even want me?" And the commander looked at him and he said, "Jesus doesn't care how old you are. He doesn't care what you look like. He loves you, and he can forgive you." Well, Bulgar said, "I'll have to think about that." And then he said, "I have seen your band. Would it be possible for me to be part of it?" The captain said, "Yes, you can. You can play the bass drum." Bulgar was excited about that. And that afternoon, the band went out down to a street corner. They played all the way there. And then one of the men from the Salvation Army had a little meeting right there on the street corner, and then the band marched back playing "Good hymns and things back to the main building of the Salvation Army. This time of year at Christmas, there's always people from the Salvation Army standing in front of stores and on streets and stuff, ringing their bell with a big red pot in front of them, and they're gathering money to help the poor and the hungry and to get clothes for people. Bulgar, he loved playing that big drum. Matter of fact, that drum had never been hit so hard in its life. And he did okay keeping up with the music. You know, he could hit the drum in time. But his feet and his legs were getting old, and he had a hard time keeping up with them as they marched back. Bulgar, because of the cold, you know, that year was the coldest winter that the South in the United States had ever had. Matter of fact, there was snow on places that nobody could remember that there'd ever been snow. And it wasn't just a little bit. And they had blizzards and terrible wind. And it was just so cold. And the people that didn't have homes and things, that lived in the alleyways of the city, they were nearly freezing to death. And because of the extreme cold, the work that a lot of people didn't happen during that winter. So there was a lot of families and mothers with their children that had no place to go because they couldn't earn any more money. Well, that is kind of what happened to Bulgar as well. He did odd jobs, but it was too cold and nobody would hire him. So Bulgar started going to the Salvation Army building, and he would sit and he would listen to the meetings about Jesus, and then he would eat his dinner there. And on those nights that it was so cold, he would even stay there. He had been doing this for some time. And the captain came to him and he said, "Bulgar, have you thought about what we talked about giving your heart to Jesus?" And Bulgar said, "I've thought about it, but I have a friend, and he's keeping me from doing it." The commander said, "Well, it doesn't sound like he's a very good friend if he's keeping you away from Jesus." And Bulgar's head went down, and he said, "You're probably right, but I haven't been able to give him up yet." And the commander looked at him and he said, Your friend isn't alcohol, is it?" And Bulgar said, "No, I don't drink. It's not that. It's something else." Well, the commander, he said, if you ever want to talk about it, but remember that Jesus loves you and he'll forgive your sins. So that went on for some time. Well, with the terrible cold, the band couldn't go out and play. So Bulgar came fairly frequently to the Salvation Army. It was the dead of winter, and it was Christmas time. And during the daytime, the helpers there from the Salvation Army would put on their coats and their wraps and hats and gloves, and they would go door to door asking people if they couldn't contribute money to help them feed the poor. Well, some days all they had to feed that whole huge group of people was maybe bread and cheese and coffee. That was all they had. You know, down in 1892, a little bit of money went a lot further than it does these days. When the storms and stuff went on and on and on, pretty soon the people were having almost nothing to give. The Christmas was coming. And one thing the Salvation Army had always done was every year in the building of the Salvation Army, they would have a Christmas tree. The Christmas tree was for the poor children. And this year, they had about 50 small children living there. And the captain, he couldn't figure out what he was going to do. They always made sure there was a small gift for every child. And the Christmas tree, that was the thing that the kids looked forward to every year. And all the children out on the streets knew about the Salvation Army's Christmas tree. But the commander, he was sad. He couldn't figure out where to get any more money. And the little bit of money that was coming in, it just had to go for food and to buy coal for the stove to keep the people warm. I'm going to have to tell the kids that there's not going to be a Christmas tree this year. Oh, he didn't want to do it. It almost made him want to cry to think about it. For a lot of those children, this was the only time that they ever got a gift or had a Christmas tree that they could look at. And one afternoon, Bulgar came in. The captain went up to him again, and he said, "Have you made a decision yet for Jesus?" And he said, "I'm still working on that." Well, then the commander and the captain, they had sat down, and they talked about this problem of the Christmas tree and the presents. And they were both really sad. And as they were talking, all of a sudden there was this huge, huge noise. And everybody kind of jumped and looked around. They couldn't see anything. And then the captain said, "It's okay, folks. It's just Bulgar playing on the bass drum. He thinks better," he says, "when he can play the drum." Well, it was Bulgar. At the top of the stairs, there was a little room where they kept all their instruments. And Bulgar had gone in there to think about whether he could give his heart to Jesus, if he was willing to give away the one thing that was keeping him from Jesus. Well, he played on that drum for quite a while. Then he came downstairs and he disappeared off into the city. Well, the next day was the 20th of December. They had to make a decision about the Christmas tree. Well, the decision was made on its own. There was no money. There was no money to get a tree. There was no money for anything special for Christmas for the kids to eat. There just wasn't anything. So it was decided that the captain would have to get up tonight and tell the kids and the parents that there would be no Christmas tree this year. Well, evening came. It was time for the meeting. The captain, he always got up, and I could call it preaching or talking to the people about Jesus. And he was always happy and jolly, but tonight he was sad. so sad he just wanted to cry. And big men, captains especially, don't cry. He got behind one of the tables and he stood there and he was quiet for a while. All the people had taken a seat and they looked at him strangely. And he started to talk. He said, "This has been such a bad winter. We're having trouble just keeping coal for the stove and food to feed all of you. We're doing the best we can, but there's no money for the Christmas tree." And then Bulgar came in the door, and he sat down, and he listened to what the captain was saying, and he said, "No money for the Christmas tree. No money for a special treat for dinner. There's no money for presents." Well, the bigger kids, they'd had disappointments before. Their faces fell and they were sad, but they didn't say anything. But the little children, some of them started to sob. They were so sad. The one thing they'd looked forward to for months and months wasn't going to happen. And then the captain turned around, and Bulgar had gone all the way around the outside of all those tables, and he'd come up to the captain. And he said, "I've decided to do it. I'm going to give my heart to Jesus. I'm going to let him save me. And I'm going to do something else." And he pulled out of the inside of his coat a big bag, and it rattled when he took it out. And he reached out and he grabbed the captain's hand and he set that big bag in it, and he said, "This was my friend. I'm going to give it away. And I want you to count it right now." Well, the captain, he didn't know that Bulgar would have any money, but he poured that money out on the table, and he sat down, and everybody in that room was quiet. The only thing you could hear was the clinking of those gold and silver coins as he put one on top of each other and counted them. Finally, he turned to Bulgar and he said, $600.85. That was a humongous amount of money in those days. And he looked at Bulgar, and Bulgar said, "You must have made a mistake. It's 680 cents. And then Bulgar, he stood up and he looked at the captain and he said, "I want you to have it all. I want you to get what you need for here. And I want you to get the Christmas tree for the young'uns. And I want you to get presents for every one of them." Boys and girls, years and years, Bulgar had kept his money. And he had made a hole under that hut that he lived in the dirt. And every time he was able to work out and he got a little money, he put it in that bag and he covered it up with dirt. When he had brought that bag to the captain, it was still covered with mud. But Bulgar, having money, had been the one thing that kept him away from Jesus. And when he was finally willing to share what he had with others, he felt that Jesus would accept him. Hundreds of people, oodles and oodles of children, had a wonderful Christmas that year because Bulgar realized that Jesus would want him to share. Boys and girls, I will talk to you next week. You have a good week now. Bye-bye.